evening, folks, and welcome to the Darkling podcast, episode number 17. For those listeners of you who don't know, the Darkling is Darker Days' sister show, where we focus on material that is submitted by or created by our listeners or other points of general interest. Tonight on the show, I'm joined by my regular companion, Mike, and for the first time, guesting on Darker Days and on the Darkling is Chris. Well, welcome aboard, guys.
Hello, this is Chris. Hi, how are you all doing? It's a pleasure to be here, or may not be, we'll see.
Yo, what's up, dudes?
Yo. Tonight on the Darkling podcast, we're going to be taking a look at Ghouls, specifically via the medium of Ghouls' Fatal Addiction, the source book for Vampire the Masquerade, and then we're going to take a closer look at them in the Requiem game, and also take a more general examination of retainers in the World of Darkness, and maybe draw in some inspiration from a couple of the other World of Darkness games, and maybe even one or two ideas from outside the World of Darkness to enhance your experience of the Minions of the Night. We feature a review that's been sent our way by Marquis Von Vimanys on Ghouls' Fatal Addiction, and we'll be getting around to that right shortly, and then joining you again afterwards for some more expansive discussion of the same.
Good evening, this is Marquis. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Ghouls' Fatal Addiction, a supplement for Vampire the Masquerade. It was released during White Wolf's Year of the Ally in 1997, along with a slew of other supplements detailing the allies and subordinate factions of the main races of the old World of Darkness. This supplement gives you the opportunity to play as ghouls, mortals fed a steady diet of vampire blood, rendering them immune to the march of time, as well as granting them some of the powers of their masters. As can well be imagined, a ghoul's life is far from easy. Their consumption of their master's or domitor's blood creates a powerful but artificial emotional bond towards them. They're also mostly used as pawns, assets, and tools, as they can operate during the daylight hours, and thus interact with the mortal world to a far greater extent than their masters. As can be guessed by looking at the cover, Ghouls' Fatal Addiction is a bit more of an adult supplement than some of the other Vampire the Masquerade books. There is an inherent eroticism and sensuality to be found in the relationship between a ghoul and their domitor, which is something that not every group will want to go into, but can certainly be interesting if done right. The book proper begins in Chapter 1, which, interestingly enough, is written from the point of view of a noted Malkavian character in the metaplot, Dr. Netchurch. In his study of ghouls that is used as this chapter, he highlights some of the physiological changes brought on by the process of ghouling. Ghouls can use blood to heal, pump their physical abilities, and power the disciplines their domitors teach them. The blood also halts cell decay, so ghouls do not age. Of course, these perks also come with downsides, and ghouls must be cautious with the vitae they imbibe. Vampires generally give seldom and little of themselves, and the emotional and physical symptoms of withdrawal can have very serious consequences for ghouls and the people around them. Overdose is also possible, and can endow a ghoul with a beast as potent as their masters, as well as causing problems with oxygen and nitrogen levels in the blood, and permeating fluids such as tears and sweat with blood. They may also, if they drink too much of their master, develop the clan flaws of their master's particular bloodline. Chapter 2, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting ones in the book. It is presented in the format of a transcript of a seminar conducted by a secret ghoul society known as the Unmastered, who will be discussed later. Throughout the piece, the lecturer offers a refreshingly different perspective on the Childer of Cain. The followers of Set, for example, contrary to most vampires, he typifies as a genuine threat. He reasons that, in order to further their aims of corruption, they give their mortal thralls and friends everything they could possibly desire, inspiring fierce loyalty and friendship. If you're one of those players or storytellers who have encountered the dreaded fishmalk before, you'll be quite pleased to read the Malkavian section, which dispels any notion of bunny slippers or, well, fish, and exposes Malkavians for the terrifying, unstable monsters that they truly are. The rest of the chapter exposes the norm in the different clans and how they treat their ghouls, and there's some very interesting story and character ideas to be found in here. The La Sombra, for instance, following their strong social Darwinist philosophy, despise ghouls, but some still keep them as groomers, as, lacking a reflection, they have no ability to groom themselves. Ghouls of other clans can face similar problems from fickle and abusive domitors. Toreador ghouls, for example, must constantly dance an awkward and delicate dance to maintain their domitor's favour. Chapter 3 details the systems for creating ghoul characters. Specifically, it allows you to choose from 3 character types. Vassals are ghouls as most imagine them, under the thrall of their domitors. Independents are ghouls who have broken free from their master's control and must now survive on their own, either by stalking their former masters and taking their fix by force, or by hiring themselves out as mercenaries and contractors to enterprising vampires. Finally, the supplement allows you to create and play a character hailing from one of the revenant families of the Sabbat. Created through the intense breeding programs and biological tinkering of the clan Tzimisce, a revenant family is made by breeding vitae-infused ghouls with one another, and feeding infants vampire blood from birth. The result is that revenants' bodies produce their own supply of vitae, and age and mature at a much slower rate than regular humans. This, as well as aberrations caused by inbreeding and being brought up in a thoroughly inhuman environment, means that each revenant family, although more potent than most ghouls, inherit certain family flaws and generally have trouble blending in with mortal society and its standards. The templates and storytelling chapters provide a number of interesting ideas for chronicles, stories, as well as characters. The storytelling chapter details secret ghoul societies as well that you can use in games or chronicles. The Unmastered, a group of ghouls and revenants who offer protection and support to ghouls escaping abusive or absent domitors, are especially interesting. They could easily be introduced into a game or chronicle as a possible ally or even a threat. The character templates are also very good. One in particular illustrates the problems of a ghoul developing a jealous streak in their personality. Another illustrates some of the psychological aberrations that can develop in a revenant character. Ironically, Ghoul's Fatal Addiction proves itself, in my regards at least, to be one of the best and most thematically powerful books in the entire Masquerade line. It allows for the telling of racy, passionate, obsessive psychodramas and unparalleled role-playing opportunities. As mentioned in the storytelling section of the book, there is perhaps no better way to show the horror that vampires can represent than through different eyes, ones that, more likely than not, will be gouged out on their master's whims. This is Marquis, and I'd like to thank you for listening.
Alright, Ghoul's Fatal Addiction. I'm just going to lead off. This is actually the first source book I ever read. It was very awkward purchasing it from Borders. I actually flipped it over so the cashier would not see the cover with the the bondage chicks on it and like the weird vampire and stuff.
I distinctly remember getting my first vampire book and my mother looking at it and going, "Oh, that's nice," and well, no complaints at that end. But
Excellent.
Yeah,
I think it's a fascinating book, and that's a great little review there by Marquis. I didn't realize it was that old. You know, he says at the beginning this is from the year of the Ally, and I'm thinking, well, no, it's not. It's got to be from at least 2000. And no, wait, he's right. It is. It's like 1997.
Year of the Ally was
98.
97.
97, 98 or something. Yeah. So it goes back, but it's like he says in the review, an exceptionally thorough and an in-depth look at the creatures across the board.
one thing I really liked was the the Dr. Nat Church section that he discussed a little bit, because it goes through and talks about their anatomy, also talks about different factions within the ghouls and all that. And it's pretty cool because it's also annotated by Beckett and Lucida, who are, two of the favorite signature characters for Vampire the Masquerade.
What I liked about it was the idea that you can focus upon ghouls as the central figures in your chronicle. I always thought it would be an interesting idea to have a Vampire the Masquerade chronicle where the player characters are ghouls for at least some part of the chronicle, if not the entirety of it, and where actual vampires almost never appear, where they are these really horrifying, sinister, destructive forces that lurk in the background of your world. So if you have, for example, the characters and members of some of the Revenant families, which are discussed, well, in a lot of places actually, but in the Ghouls' Fatal Addiction book, and maybe one of the actual vampires, their Domitors, only turns up once or twice in the chronicle. I'm not a big comic book fan, but I remember reading a discussion of, I think it was a Superman comic years ago. I don't even remember what the comic was or in what context, but the reviewer made this comment that the writer of the comic book had portrayed the Man of Steel as something of an earthbound god whose presence is almost noted more by the after effects of him having passed through the world. And I always, that kind of image always stuck with me, and I thought that would be a fascinating way in a ghoul-based chronicle to portray vampires. They're these things that are so far beyond your level of power that when one turns up, it's like a hurricane that passes right through your world and totally upends things and totally revokes things, and at the same time you're horrified by its passage, but at the same time you're desperate to come back again. And I think this book manages to bring that concept out extremely well.
It's very then you're suggesting it's very platonic, because as a ghoul you can, because of the mundane reality that they more easily exist in, you can see how these rather powerful supernatural actions ripple through into rather simple parts of everyday life. But you can really go, that is because this vampire took down a certain company through whatever means he's used, such as subverting the CEO or using mind control of some form, or simply just killing everyone, and then seeing how that affects some guy because he can't pay his rent because he now doesn't have a job because the company went under. And that's quite cool. That shows how horrific they are and just beyond understanding, because you just have for a normal person, you have no idea why any of this has happened.
Definitely. Yeah, and having ghouls as your central focus allows you to, you can shine some spotlight on it so they can understand a little bit of what's going on, so they know there's these kindred moving around behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the world, and almost that proximity almost makes it worse, because you understand your impotence all the more because you know what's coming, you know what's caused it, and you kind of have this desperate, almost, well, I guess as the cover of the supplement suggests, this almost sadomasochistic yearning to be part of this world. Yet if you do, it'll just destroy you.
Yeah, and likewise, it also introduces the independent or rogue ghouls, who are no longer have the Dominator, but they are trying to still keep up their ghoul powers and get blood from either bartering for it or hunting down other vampires. And it's very interesting that you get this whole very independent take on them, but they're also still very weak. And it's interesting comparison to like Hunters Hunted, which also had these lone wolf ghouls who were fighting vampires, but those ones were a lot more like badass, I guess you could say.
I love the idea of ghoul mercenaries selling their services to powerful vampires in return for blood. I thought that was a brilliant idea from this book, and that's one I'm certainly going to be using in the game. Very, very cool.
Great. Well, the last point I have about ghouls is that in the context of Vampire the Masquerade, a really cool fiction source is actually, it's the second book in the Victorian Age vampire trilogy by Philip, it's either Boule or Bouillet. It's called The Madness of Priests, and the main character at that point is a ghoul herself, and it's very interesting. It really takes into account what has been written previously in Vampire the Masquerade regarding ghouls. Oh,
cool. No, I haven't read that.
No, I've not had the joy of touching Vampire Victorian Age, but to have a book, a novel discussing ghouls and seeing the world through their eyes is extremely useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
that'd be really cool. I also like the idea of having ghouls, especially if they're of a revenant family, that the idea that once in a generation or once every 20 years, the Domitor turns up and selects one for the embrace, so you can have this crazy bloodlust competition, political backstabbing, all the way down to actual outright fights, to be the one left standing who's going to be chosen by sinister Uncle Ivan when he next comes calling to receive immortality. I think that would be an awful lot of fun to portray. And I think what's also particularly good about Ghouls' Fatal Addiction, if you take the mechanics out of it, the fluff and setting elements port just as well over to the modern game as well. I say modern game, I mean the New World of Darkness to Requiem. I'm sure you can't use all of the clans that are there, but there's enough similarity in the archetypes that you can map them to the modern clans and covenants fairly well. And the general concept of a ghoul really hasn't changed that much, although, as I believe you were saying earlier on, Chris, the way that Requiem approaches ghouls and the thoroughness with which it treats them really does bear further examination.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get more into that when we look at Requiem's own book on ghouls, but the added layer within that book is the whole fact that you have not only how clans make use of their ghouls, but how their use is then further coloured by whichever covenant they belong to. And it's quite diverse and very interesting. Again, can definitely be ported back into Masquerade. In some sorts, does Ghouls' Fatal Addiction look at how the Sabbath look at ghouls? I'm sure must be some parts of that book that talks about how the Sabbath make use of ghouls or their view on them. It must be quite horrific.
Yes. I remember one point was that, I'm pretty sure this is the spot, they don't usually use ghouls too much because they have the shovel heads, but one use they had was making a whole bunch of ghouls and giving them guns and sending them out hunting in lupine territory. And if they kill one or two, good enough.
Yes, that's the good old Sabbath for you right there.
Actually, I just remembered, there's some pretty funky things in there. First off, Ghouls' Fatal Addiction is probably one of the most mature White Wolf titles that is not Black Dog. There's some really messed up stuff in there. And one I remember is the games they play with the ghouls, kind of like in Elysium and stuff. One's like they have them binge drink blood and see what happens. I remember it's pretty messed up.
Do they also have bits like being used as furniture or elaborate candelabra, holding candles but being told not to move, and being killed if they do, and having to endure the pain of being scorched by it? Requiem Ghouls is equally filled with as many horrible acts that vampires make their ghouls do to them. There's one wonderful line where it talks about the Deva's use of the ghouls and just how every ghoul doesn't look forward to when their master comes home in a very bad mood. And of course, Deva, vigor, that's going to be some pretty nasty broken bones and bruises there. But, they accept it because they love their master. Excellent. Does Ghouls' Fatal Addiction also include anything about animal ghouls or plant-based ghouls? The Mandragora that Requiem talks about.
There are animal ghouls. It's actually got some statistics for that, but nothing about plant ghouls. Those did not exist in Masquerade, as far as I know. And actually, I think this is a good point to move over to ghouls in the Requiem setting. If
definitely,
yeah, sure.
So they have the book for Requiem is just called Ghouls?
It's just called Ghouls. It's laid out into two primary chapters. The first part simply looks at what a ghoul is, and it looks at the ghouls based on each clan and then each covenant. It then goes into ghouls' families and bloodlines and how you create those. And it starts dealing with the nasty subject of incest. And then it looks into animal ghouls and, of course, the plant ghouls, the Mandragora, which is something which is very cool, as in that they make these ghouled plants that feed on vampire blood, the way they change and how they can take this sap that they can drink that has addictive properties for vampires. And then the second part really looks more at the game effects of being a ghoul and for each of the families. So they put forward 5 sample ghoul families, one based on each of the clans, which is quite obvious. And
are those similar to the Revenant families in Masquerade? In idea?
Yeah, they're exactly the same idea. So they don't need to be constantly topped up with a feeding of blood. They gain all the benefits of being a ghoul, but they are not having to seek out blood every month or so. Instead, they have all the benefits, and they're born really with this need to perform services for a vampire, and then vampires come along to these families and select from them servants or possible proteges and someone to embrace.
Cool. So I mean, let's just dial back a little bit there. These Mandragora things, I'm not overly familiar with Requiem's take on ghouls. So do these things start out as normal plants that are just
They're exactly that. They are
vitae instead of given blood instead of water.
Yeah, they are plants which are fed over time vitae, and it has an effect upon them. So I'll just check my wonderful notes on here because there's loads of bits to this. So generally they choose very tough, hardy plants. So a cactus would possibly be very good for this. Or trees cactus. Even. Vampire cactus. Insane. Literally any plant you can think of that can endure lots of hardship would be the perfect choice to ghoul. It seems very strange talking about plants, and I'm going to ghoul this plant. But anyway, and then it can simply survive on blood. It no longer needs any form of nutrients in the soil. It no longer needs water. It no longer needs light. The plant becomes more sickly looking. So darker leaves, pockmarking or mottled effects on the leaves. And then it begins to grow inward. So the way it talks about this is that the leaves twist and grow inward. So it's almost kind of gathering around this gathered vitae within it.
Wow.
And then here's the final kicker with all these. First of all, these plants will feed on any blood then given to them, and they will try and slowly move towards it. So these plants can move, if only small distances, or lash out with their vines. And their leaves will point towards any source of blood that walks by them, vitae or normal mortal blood.
Oh, interesting.
So they're quite horrific in that sense. So one of the examples given, which is a type of mandragora which is kept by one of the ghoul families, is a willow tree, but becomes completely black. And the danger is, of course, being entwined in its branches that droop down, which is great. And then the sap that I talked about, which is called the lacrima, which is literally a sap which you just drain off these plants. So you can vampires can feed upon it instead of using blood. And the way they describe it is a strange but queerly tasting sap which they enjoy, and which, as I said, leads to addiction. And plus you can poison people with it. Normal mortals can just be poisoned. So yeah, Mandragora, totally cool. And of course, when you consider the type of covenants within Requiem, there are definite culprits for who would love to create these things. You know, the Ordo Dracal or the Circle of the Crone, because it's the perfect example of experimentation or the act of creation.
Do the Mandragora gain any kind of sentience beyond a rudimentary knowledge of where to find blood?
No, they just basically become predatory and will seek out blood when they can get it. We're not talking Little Shop of Horrors here.
I had an NPC statted out for a Dark Sun game based on an undead intelligent hunting cactus called Lord Doomspite, but that's neither here nor there. So who wrote this book? Because it sounds like a crazy set of ideas.
Let's have a look. I've got it in front of me just in case I want to reference anything else. But we have authors are Darcy and Anastasia, Carl Bowen, and Rick Chillot, Ray Fawkes, and Ian Price, who are names that I don't recall as often as others.
No.
But,
Carl Bowen. Come on, guys. He wrote Predator and Prey Vampire.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit bad with my author list. I usually just go straight into the content and indulge myself. But yeah, it's definitely a great book to read. This one, and the artwork is excellent throughout.
And it's a softcover, presumably.
It's I have this in PDF, so I
okay,
don't.
Right.
But
I think it's a hardcover.
Have seen it, and it's hardcover, as all these things are back in the day. Because it's quite an old book. It's let me just get the date on this one. This one is 2005. So because I remember.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, it's quite an early book.
Yeah. Outstanding.
Very cool. I actually have a few points I came up with because I actually read the Requiem core book thoughts on ghouls this morning. And one thing that came up is that each month when a ghoul is fed vitae, either the vampire or the ghoul has to use a point of willpower. And that's pretty extreme. I know what they're doing with this. They're trying to make it so that a PC didn't just like make an army of ghouls and have them hunt lupines or something. But the paragraph that was explaining this doesn't really describe why or how that willpower is spent. It just says that here's the requirement, but there's no like story reason why. So I was thinking like maybe we could put our heads together and come up with some ideas of why this would be occurring.
Well, Mage does something similar with that with Legacies, which is a sort of they call it often the Z splat between your the usual kind of X and Y splats that it has in there, the 5x5. They have this additional one, which is a relationship between a personal relationship between a mentor and a student, where a mentor can teach a student these various abilities that fall outside the purview of the normal, I want to call them spheres, but they're called arcana in anyway.
Yeah.
And then in there's a willpower expenditure that goes on while the student is dedicating themselves to learning these new magical talents, or where the teacher is dedicating themselves to teaching them. And in the first case, it's actually a willpower dot that gets spent, unless I'm very much mistaken, and then thereafter it's willpower points. So it could be something as simple as perhaps the ghoul itself is spending the willpower to prevent itself from attacking the vampire in just a frenzy of bloodlust, where it gets this overwhelming addictive rush and just wants more and more and more, and might throw itself at the vampire in a frenzy of hunger. So on the part of the ghoul, maybe the willpower represents the creature holding itself back, and likewise from the point of the vampire, maybe the willpower point represents the vampire forcing itself just to give the ghoul enough to prevent a frenzy, or to prevent itself from feeding on the ghoul when the bloodlust arises on either of them. I don't know. That could work.
Or it's maybe the very act of really passing on the curse itself through the blood. I mean, it has to be forced upon the ghouls. It's almost like that point of willpower is the vampire corrupting the ghoul's soul in some way through the blood, and also is like the very act of forcing upon them the disciplines themselves, and really allowing them to master the vitae that they're given.
So just the exchange of blood is not enough. There has to be something. There has to be something spiritual going on there. You're saying the vampire has to almost imprint its own curse upon the ghoul.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I like that.
Very interesting. And that kind of point about willpower actually got me thinking about something which is a little finicky between Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire the Requiem. So Requiem's supposed to have more vampires, correct?
I wouldn't say more. I always imagine it was something about the same. I can't remember the numbers in Requiem off by heart, where it suggests the ratio of vampires to humans in the city, but it's variable though, obviously.
All right. Well, let's just say that there's more, because I for some reason remember this. There's like more vampires, and I would guess more ghouls, but you have to like spend willpower to make a ghoul, and then spend dots to make another vampire to embrace them in Requiem. So why are there more if it's so much tougher? And one interesting thing about the differences between Masquerade and Requiem is that Requiem, it's a lot harder to hunt and feed, and that's something they really like to drive home. It's not like Masquerade where you can kind of like brush it under the rug sometimes.
You take some dots in herd and then just roll a few dice. And
yeah,
exactly.
Away. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, just to take a side view on that, the idea of having to spend willpower to embrace, dots or points to create ghoul, I suppose that would be one of the first house rules I would import into a Masquerade game from Requiem, just because I think it's such a damn cool idea. But to answer your question more directly, gives me the impression then that you might want to say then that the vampires of Requiem are more driven because they're spending this willpower, and yet they're regaining it. So they're clearly acting in such a way as to restore these temporary or semi-permanent losses. Mm-hmm. And that strikes me as that portrays to me creatures who are far more driven, far more needy, far more hungry, far more compelled by their curse to restore their lost reserves when they've expended them in this way.
Well, after all, they'll be driven because the willpower is representative of the only thing that's stopping them becoming more depraved monsters. So
yeah,
it's the dance macabre for you. They're going to have to keep doing things to keep them away from that drop into the abyss. And yeah, being a vampire is hard, isn't it?
Well, that's a nice mechanical way to portray that. Then the system there reinforces the setting idea of this, dance around the spiral to stop yourself slipping over the edge and down the plug hole. You have a system there that represents that extremely well then with the willpower expenditure. I like that.
I think willpower expenditure and more importantly the regaining willpower in games in general, I find sometimes a little hard to make players remember to make use of that mechanic when they have these virtues and vices there, and I guess sometimes the players don't realise that they're implicitly already regaining willpower. If they only just paid attention to that, oh yeah, I'm acting with my vice, yeah, I'll have that willpower point back, please, and maybe it's a bit of GM interaction there, the SC just going, oh yeah, have a willpower, you acted in character enough, you deserve it. So I think that's the only point I have with willpower in a game when running a game is having players remember, yes, take them, please, they'll save you later from dying or something worse.
Well, I agree with the Mage Chronicle I'm running at the moment. It's Ascension, but we've imported as a house rule the virtue vice concept, although we do it through I think it's through nature I've chosen. Indulging in the positive or negative side of your nature. Mage the Ascension revised did quite a good take on that. Will get you 1 or 2 points of willpower. But again, like you say, my players often forget that they have this extra stat, and I thought it would be a great way to bring nature and demeanor to the forefront in the game, and instead they just forget it's there. So it's definitely something for the storyteller to be a little more on the ball about, I think, and the game can benefit from that kind of attention.
I guess we can move the conversation over to other retainers in the new and old World of Darkness. Just to start off, well, I just want to bring up that when you look at the old World of Darkness, they pretty much always shoehorn some kind of retainer in there. For Werewolf, you had the Kinfolk. For Mage, you had
acolytes and consors and grogs and all sorts of weird terms for the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, and Demon had the fallen followers, and one that never ever did it for me was the Hunter Bystander, because the way it was portrayed in the fiction of Hunter just never came through very well. It always just seemed like it was some sidekick, basically. I'm not sure how familiar you two are with the Hunter the Reckoning line, but
not familiar whatsoever.
Not very much at all. I've looked at the core book a few times for antagonists, but not familiar with the bystander system now.
Gotcha. Well, bystanders are basically the way they're explained in the core book is that they are someone who got the calling, but then just ran away because they couldn't deal with it. They didn't know what was going on. So they're kind of aware that there's something wrong with the world, but they don't have all the imbued powers.
Right.
Now, sometimes they get dragged in to help out a hunter because maybe that hunter acted and then remembers that they were there and know what's going on. But the way it's portrayed a lot is they're just like, they're either that bystander that ran away, or it's just like, a guy's friend or buddy or young like son maybe that's just dragged into it and doesn't have the same like mental strain you would think, and just kind of like blindly accepts that all these bad things are going on. One poor portrayal was in the Hunter book Defender that I was reading. It just didn't fly.
Well, the initial concept then of a bystander as being someone who's received the call or been exposed to the supernatural world and has run away, I think is an incredibly powerful concept. And I think to get the most out of them, you'd need to focus upon that quite closely. And like you say, really portray the mental strain that these individuals are under, either as non-player characters or as player characters. And if you're going to use them as NPCs, I think what you've got there is an excellent dark mirror almost of the player characters. So if you have the player characters are the hunters who have thrown themselves whole, half-heartedly or whatever into the hunt, as it were, you can have these the bystanders show how much this has the potential to break you, and perhaps reflect on the idea that perhaps the hunter himself is broken and doesn't realize it. If you have the bystander as this somewhat shattered individual, someone who's been messed up by the experience, you can use that to help the hunter character reflect upon the fact that, well, maybe you're broken too, but you just haven't noticed it, and you're actually more like this guy than you realize.
That's definitely something that's also that use of that form of retainer, something that comes up in the way the ghouls are also used in the Requiem ghouls as well, is that they often take on a ghoul as someone to keep the vampire in check and to bring them back from the edge and to make sure that they realise you're going too far. So that's definitely very useful, especially in Mage even. That would be extremely powerful to have someone that's your acolyte and going, no, you're delving into too much occult knowledge there and going off the rails. Can you not see this?
Exactly. Yeah, very cool. And Mage has got a lot of opportunities to develop acolytes in a number of interesting ways. I'll get onto that again in a second. But I don't know, Mike, how would you tackle the bystander issue, do you think, to make them more vivid and useful in the game?
You kind of did cover it. They make very interesting NPCs, someone that perhaps the player characters go to because they saw them when they were all given the message and imbued, and there's someone that's scared, doesn't understand what's going on. I don't typically see them as like the battling adventure types that would then, they see their mistake and they join the group of hunters to take down the bad guys or something. That just doesn't seem like the correct course of action. I think that's one of the reasons why I have problems with how the bystanders come up in Hunter. They always seem like they're doing the fighting and they're fighting the good fight with the other imbued, as opposed to just trying to avoid it as much as possible and avoid that knowledge.
Right. So what is interesting about bystanders is you can draw inspiration for them from numerous, occult horror films, supernatural films. They appear as fairly stark characters in a lot of these films, like in The Omen, and I think there's something like that in End of Days and in the Prophecy films. Often you'll see them portrayed as, an occult or vampire hunter who's fallen into alcoholism, or some crazy priest who's seen the face of the Antichrist in his breakfast cereal, and now he hides out in his hotel room the whole time, plastering all the walls with pages from the Bible and crosses, or like the priest from the Omen film who's horribly burnt and disfigured and stuck out in the monastery, yet he's still able to point the protagonist in the direction of the jackal's grave and that kind of thing. So there's some strong archetypes or stereotypes there that you can go to in fiction for inspiration, which I think can work quite well.
I would say for Hunter in particular, possibly one of the best examples of a bystander is the Blade films with Whistler. He's old, he's been there, done that, dying of cancer. So he's fighting all these supernatural creatures, but mortality has caught up with him, and so what's he do? He makes guns. So, and he has obviously a cynical view on vampires and people that are almost turned by vampires, which is shown in the first Blade film. His view to the doctor, Karen, can't remember her last name, but she's bitten, and he's like, oh yeah, just put her down. You bring back strays, but Blade chooses not to for his own folly, maybe. But it's a good counterpoint.
That's a very good example. Well, stepping then away from Hunter for a moment, we mentioned Mage a minute ago, and Mage has a number of different ranks of retainer, from those who are your, who are your cultists, who maybe believe in the supernatural but don't have any real experience of it, to those who have no real understanding of the supernatural at all, probably don't even know you're a mage, but nevertheless serve and help you, to those who are semi-awakened or semi-aware members of your direct inner circle, to those who are partially awakened, or what they used to call static mages and sorcerers. And there's all these different kind of gradations of it. And a number of the examples we've given so far can apply equally to those, especially the one that you mentioned, Chris, about having the acolyte be a reflection of the mage in some way or form to help ground them in reality while they're busy, trying to call down the supernal into their bedroom. And Ascension had an interesting, I think it was called Ascension's Right Hand, actually, an interesting source book on acolytes. And in there, it had rules for developing characters, everything from the guy down the street right the way through to some strange, familiar creature from the spirit world that you managed to embody inside a physical form. So for mages, as far as the retainers go, it doesn't even need to be human. It can be completely out there, completely very strange. But one of the strongest things I think about mages, by either Ascension and Awakening, doesn't actually come from the mage game at all, and in fact draws back to Ars Magica, which is in a certain respect one of the predecessors of mage, at least in concept, if not in execution. And in there, they had this thing called troop play, where the mages, a lot of the chronicles were based around chantries, the sort of the mage hideouts and headquarters. And often you would create a mage, but you would also create what they called grogs, which are your acolytes and your retainers. So you'd create your mage and a small handful of his servants and acolytes, and then you would take turns in playing the mages, and also then you have stories based around the acolytes. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about at near the beginning of the show, about revenant families and ghouls, where the vampires almost never appear. And I think you can get a really strong game based around these lesser cultists and lesser adherents of a mage, where the mage himself could even be an NPC, or only played by one of the characters, or maybe the players share who gets to play the mage. Or this week you're going to get to play Porthos, and next week I'll be playing it. And I think you can draw inspiration there for all of the World of Darkness games in a way to approach these less powerful retainers living in a supernaturally powerful world, by taking the focus off the more powerful supernatural creatures and placing it upon their servants and minions.
That's really cool.
I think I don't know if it was actually printed, but there was a Doctor Who game that talked about this idea where people would take it in turns to play the Time Lord. And most of the gameplay would take place through the companions, and you'd kind of pass the Doctor around the table as a shared character from week to week. I think there's some fun ideas there that can be imported into the World of Darkness too.
Very interesting.
Within Awakening, there isn't a book like you mentioned that's in Ascension, but I would guess the best place to go for that kind of thing is maybe Guardians of the Veil, because they talk about their mystery cults and how you build these up, and it's a means to draw people through lower mysteries as a way of protecting the Atlantean mysteries and magic, so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands, but also selecting individuals who would be of worth. My reading of that's a good book for again, development of cults and picking out individuals who would be useful for an Atlantean mage's own needs and to help them in some way. Another book which is, I think, I've been finding quite an excellent read. I've been looking at Seers of the Throne.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things I find entirely just such a scary concept for a bunch of pentacle mages is the fact that the very people that you're fighting against aren't really the people you're meant to be fighting against. They are puppets manipulated by the mages of the seers. So they're orchestrated and used via either mundane things such as just money and mind control and simple magical tricks to things as grand as, the profane Urim, or I believe in Scissor Throne, is there an upgraded version or something where, because I haven't got to that point yet looking through the artifacts, but I believe there's meant to be one which allows not only the seer to take control of a person, a simple mortal, but to also use his magic through them. And that's kind of scary in the idea of the classic Matrix idea that you can't trust anyone because anyone could be an agent. That same paranoia can be used. And again, there's nothing stopping a player mage using those same tactics. A bit of mind magic, a bit of correspondence. You've got yourself a pawn to use against your enemies, and they're none the wiser that you've attacked them.
Exactly, and it works similarly well in Mage of the Ascension with the unawakened servants of the technocracy. Should you choose to use those as antagonists? Do you really want to burst into the lab and fry poor Bob's brain just because he's working on some strange technocratic serum that he doesn't really understand? Using them as antagonists again brings back the whole element of morality and humanity and responsibility that is so important in Mage games. And I think for to see this kind of thing in actual play, you could do worse than checking out Dave B's seminal actual play thread over on RPGNet for the Broken Diamond, which, if you're a Mage player of either Awakening or Ascension, it's on the level of a must-read. It's a fantastic account of a chronicle, and in there he's got, I think they're both player characters, actually. Two of the player characters have a circle of retainers around them. In the one case, it's a drug gang, and in the other case, it's a mystery cult, where the characters in the NPCs in the mystery cult, they're just sort of these, like an interesting riff on Golden Dawn wannabes, to go back to Aleister Crowley, and on the other hand, in the drug gang, they're sort of they're drug gangbangers basically. And in both cases, the story has a couple of really interesting twists and turns where the lives of the mages are often kept separate. Their actual magely goings-on are separate from the activities of these retainers, but every now and then they intersect and completely wreck the lives of these poor retainers. And there's a great scene where the mages have to go to the mystery cult and it pretends to be members of the mystery cult when, of course, they are in fact real mages. And I think that kind of thing works really, really well.
Well, what you've touched on there is quite important. Just briefly going back to vampires, that there's no reason why ghouls need to be aware that they are ghouls, and the same with revenant families. Why would they even be aware of it? It's just a curiosity.
Yes,
and with regard to the mind control thing, well, vampires have disciplines that also allow them to act through their ghouls, and in almost a very direct manner. Again, pulling the strings. So. Yeah, Mage is filled with inspiration. I think a lot of inspiration on how to use ghouls in more clever, less brutal ways. I say brutal as in you're not just going, yes, my minions, go attack him. You're doing something more subtle in that you're using them as literally your face to wear it to a location to spy on them.
Brilliant. Yes, excellent. I like that. Yeah.
One other point that I just kind of wanted to bring up, because I was reading Promethean the Created this morning, and Prometheans cannot...
Do I have to go to the pub now?
No. That's not until next episode.
Okay.
Prometheans cannot take the retainer merit. And the reason is because they've got the disquiet and the wasteland effects and all that.
Yeah.
But in a later Promethean source book, it mentions the possibility that people that are descendants from a Promethean that reached mortality and became human might not be affected by the disquiet.
Okay.
So that actually gives a pretty interesting way for there to be a retainer and someone who, in effect, could actually be perhaps even more powerful than the Promethean themselves, simply because they already are human and they can act as a guide to help them along in their journey.
Worse than that, such a person, because who the Promethean can quite happily sit down and talk to on a regular basis, could also act as a direct foil, as in that the Promethean realizes, well, is being human really that great? Because this person now is human, can talk to him about it, and represents humanity for them in all its wonderful ways and ugly ways. Could be the one turning point that makes a Promethean into one of the centimani.
Well, we've been talking about that throughout the show, the idea that the retainer can help, keep the supernatural creature grounded and remind them of how important humanity is. But that's an excellent point, that if you flip that, you can have a retainer perhaps portray the idea that maybe humanity is not such a great thing to want for after all, with all its foibles and flaws and failings. And that's a really nice point.
Something I've also used just recently this week, just gone by in my Changeling game, Changeling Lost. I've made use of one of the centimani as an antagonist and their retainers, and this is brought up in I'm trying to think which the Promethean books it is. Pandora's Box, obviously. The fact that the centimani can actually keep a group of Pandorans as a form of retainer, just feeding them a bit of flesh now and then, so they're fed and sated, but then they can make use of them to perform tasks and obviously learn more abilities from them in turn, and that can lead to quite horrifying scenes where you have one of these creatures, cutting off a pound of flesh and feeding it to this horde of misgotten children of the Prometheans.
Fun. I think it also works very well if you're playing, for example, a solo game or a game with only one or two players, and it lends itself especially well to the whole road trip idea of a Promethean game, where you might have one Promethean and then one of these retainers on whatever journey it's taking them, as opposed to just having a group of Prometheans. You have these two, this sort of double act thing going on. One wants to be human, and one is human, and how those two reflect off each other. I think that could work extremely well. A kind of twisted World of Darkness version on Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Or Rain Man, or Highway to Heaven even.
Excellent.
Highway to Heaven would be even the best example. That old series. God. Anyway.
Cool.
Chris, you mentioned that when you look through the different covenants in Ghouls for Requiem, there's some really good discussion of the different archetypes. So could you very quickly kind of talk about that and how it could be applied to other World of Darkness games?
I'll give you a really quick overview of each one. Basically, the Carthians, they're undecided with their Ghouls. They're not too sure whether they should give them status or keep them at the bottom, because of course the Carthians aren't too sure whether they should break the status quo, where Ghouls are your servants and should be treated as such, or they should let them be equal to them. So Carthians have a real difficult time with Ghouls, but of course they have it easy, as in Carthians want Ghouls so they can connect to the modern world and understand it better than any of the others. A very cool idea that's brought up in the Carthian section is about the idea of creating splinter cells of Ghouls. So they're your blue-collar workers, because the Carthians already know, let's not go for the top guy, that's been done before. Don't take over don't Ghoul the CAO, because someone from the Invictus or whoever's already done that, and they've done that for years. So the Carthians create these groups of Ghouls just to subvert companies and organisations. So I quite like that idea of a splinter cell of Ghouls to do your dirty work in that way. And it's generally considered that Ghouls have a better life with the Carthians than most others, but that's of no surprise. The Crone have their votaries, who they can be anything from servants to possible proteges. And it's interesting that the Crone kind of revere Ghouls. So, because a Ghoul is a representation of creation, but this means Ghouls don't have a good time, because the Crone believe in tribulation. So Ghouls with the Crone have a tough life, and of course Ghouls help with recovering mortal sacrifices for various rituals for the Crone. The interesting thing really will come with the Lancair, who are a good counterpoint to the Crone in that sense. The Lancair obviously consider themselves above humanity. They're the chosen ones of God, the Sin Eaters in some respects. And so they see Ghouls as just basic servants, They're there to carry their books around, to organise their mass, and to again gather sacrifices. And the important things that it notes in the Lanka is they're unlikely to ever embrace their ghouls. In fact, they consider them very lucky to even be gifted with any vitae whatsoever. And there's a very interesting Theban sorcery ritual, which is designed to limit the disciplines that a ghoul can learn, even as far as preventing the ghoul from using disciplines whatsoever, because they believe that ghouls are beneath even being allowed to use the gifts of Longinus. The Ordo Dracal have a different position on this again. Ghouls either fall into being property, so they're servants, and they select these from the ghoul families that they've established, or they're potential proteges. The benefit of being property is you do your job and you're not bothered. Or, if you're a protege though, it means you're constantly watched and constantly tested. So it's a question of really what's a better life. The main point to make with the Ordo Dracal with regard to how they choose their proteges is they will choose them based upon observation of the dragon's tail. This is where a member of the Ordo Dracal will do something such as killing a mortal or destroying an established business or setting fire to a home, and watching the chain of events unfold, and from that picking out someone to turn into a ghoul and a potential protege. And then, of course, there's the absolute horrific life of being one of the Ordo Dracal's experiments. And then finally, we have the Invictus, who basically see ghouls as their serfs and vassals. These are submissive ghouls, and they establish their own form of hierarchy, which the Invictus find a bit of a joke. So there's kind of the idea of a Stockholm syndrome with the Invictus ghouls, and also you find Invictus make use of the ghouls to be either proxies in court, to be a courier because they mistrust modern technology, or to be pawns in their mortal affairs. So there's quite a variation on how the Covenants make use of their ghouls. It crosses over in some places, but there's enough differences to make them stand out. What are your views on that stuff, then? I
wanted to touch on the idea of ghouls and disciplines, because I always thought this was one of the most interesting angles in the game. I know in Masquerade, essentially they gain the physical disciplines, celerity, potence, and fortitude. Is that reflected in Requiem as well?
That's definitely reflected in Requiem, and they find it easier to learn the physical disciplines associated with their parent clan.
Right.
But also, it notes that if you're of a bloodline, so if a vampire's of a bloodline, through expenditure of willpower, so you know how you mentioned that you spend a point of willpower, one of them spends a point of willpower and they become a ghoul. If you spend a point of willpower at each step along the blood bond, the bloodline speciality discipline can also be passed on and taught to the ghoul. So you can get very specialized ghouls. So obviously you've invested a hell of a lot in them. This very act of force of will upon the ghoul to corrupt it in such a way that it can then make use of whichever speciality discipline that you're touting.
Well, I really like the idea of ghouls who develop beyond the physical disciplines. And not that you should have them all like that, but I remember when I was my last vampire game, the idea that you can have one ghoul who, for example, who had been learning thaumaturgy, or a ghoul who'd learned how to specialize in auspex. And I think these can make some very standout NPCs. And it ties in nicely to the concept of ghoul mercenaries. So the ghoul may stipulate that, fine, you pay me in blood, you don't pay me in blood. I'm particularly interested in this vicissitude thing that you speak of. And I think that can add a large amount of color. But then the point that you make that There are vampires who don't want to teach them these things at all because they're not worthy of learning these sacred God-given powers. It can set up a nice angle of tension between the vampire and its ghoul, where the ghoul might be yearning for the vampire to teach him these sacred tricks or blessed ideas or clan secrets. And if the vampire refuses, eventually this could start to erode the ghoul's loyalty, and that adds an extra dimension of color to the relationship there, which I think is quite cool.
Oh, definitely. It's quite interesting the way that they've allowed ghouls to potentially learn speciality disciplines. It just adds an extra tool to any vampire's toolbox there, and. Some of you mentioned mercenaries. One of the bloodlines ghoul families, so the equivalent of revenant families in Requiem, is definitely that. They're a bunch of mercenaries. They're a family that's lost any knowledge of what they truly are, and hunting packs, going after vampires.
Excellent.
That's quite a scary thing. You're going down an alley, you see a homeless person, you go, that's an easy bite to eat, and then you're set upon by 5 or 10 homeless people who are all part of this extended ghoul family, and you've just become lunch.
Brilliant.
A bit of turning the table on a vampire, but
that's a brilliant idea. That is, yeah. Very cool.
It maybe stops a player character from being so blasé about killing people in an alleyway. You go, oh, not again. You're going to go hunt down there? Let's make you work for your dinner for once.
Yes, indeed. Very cool.
Cool. Is that it?
I think that really is about it with anything that truly stands out as different in Ghouls in Requiem. There's obviously points about thrall families, such as how they age slower and how this can affect children. And it goes into detail about how you even start breeding a ghoul family, and that it's a very rare event, and that it's the ability to be within one of these ghoul families. So you have all the benefits of being a ghoul, but you don't need to feed on blood so frequently. Is only passed on via the mothers in the family, and of course the best chance of having more ghoul children is to have a ghoul copulation. But that leads, I said it leads into the dodgy subject of incest and how that again erodes the mind of these ghoul families. It's if anything, I think Ghouls for Requiem is just as horrific to read in places, and interesting bits of storytelling, especially if you're playing characters in a ghoul family.
Yeah. But I keep coming back to that. Keep coming back to that idea as a really strong chronicle concept, almost as if not more horrific than playing one of the vampires themselves, because you still have an element of humanity there. You still kind of are human, but in a sort of horrible "the hills have eyes" way.
Yes, entirely. And so obviously in the rules section of Requiem, it introduces a whole host of new derangements for, in particular, ghouls. So to represent how broken they can be, and of course they can be broken in many ways depending upon who their master is. If there's any particular ghoul families I find quite interesting, there's one which is the Gravenor, who are a Nosferatu-founded ghoul family, who the hills have eyes. They're all a bit physically deformed, and so hide out in their manor house. They keep these mandragora willow trees. But worse is how they actually keep getting vampire blood. They have an interesting way of going about that, and it's definitely worth potential buyers to go out in that book and read it. It's an excellent family to look into.
Yeah, cool. I think my favorite ghoul family has to be the Obertus, but then I would date them back to the ones from the Dark Ages game, specifically the Akoimatai, the sleepless monks from Constantinople, who tended the vast library of St. John Studius. Just the whole concept of a monastery that's peopled by a group of ghouls who, again, may or may not even know that they're ghouls. So, they go to Mass and they receive the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, perhaps in ways that they don't really expect. And I think that makes for a fascinating concept right there.
Oh yeah, what you just said, where they accept the blood of Christ, and that's in fact, the vampire blood that's being passed around. That's again a particular tool of the crone, and how the crone can keep cults of ghouls, and the ghouls are really none the wiser. They know they're passing around blood and it's making them feel better, but they think it's some other form of magic, or just the very act of drinking blood, when in fact, they've just all been bloodbound.
Always good.
Always good. So, with regard in-game, how your experience of using ghouls? Because right now, in my I say current, it's going to be a current vampire game again as we go into season 2 of it. My wife has a reoccurring ghoul character who's essentially the taking on the persona of her vampire character, so the business can carry on, and it's an interesting looking at the balance between being blood bonded and how that means that a ghoul has a love for their master, but it's never truly reciprocated. And at least some interesting bits of role play where I have to be this character that is this ghoul who goes, yes, I will do that for you. So, what's your views on actually running ghouls in games? Have you seen much success with them? Any excellent bits of gameplay that's come out of it?
Well, there's or
two
retainers
in general.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay. Then I'll mention 3. For two ghouls, one is, as I've just mentioned, the Akoimitai, but I developed that a bit further with the initial session of a character's embrace. The first session of a Vampire the Dark Ages game had a character who was a Knight Templar who realized that his mentor was in fact one of the undead, and lots of his brother knights, every time they took mass, were in fact imbibing his blood. So he saw this horrific thing coming. And for him it was much worse, because he wasn't just selected for ghouling, he was selected for the embrace. So that worked quite well as a foreshadowing of here are these creatures who have lost humanity, and the players and the character are filled with horror at this, and it is in fact only a pale shadow of the horror that's about to hit them, and that worked quite well. I had a ghoul in a mage game that had a really peculiar genesis. There was a vampire who was attacked by life effect from a mage the idea was that the mage wanted to cause the vampire to gestate a life form. And I had no idea what rules to use for this, so we went through this, and I developed it as a ghoul. And what was interesting about this ghoul character was it was a ghoul that was given birth to by a vampire, and the main problems that this ghoul went around wondering was, was she alive? Was she a real creature? What was she? Did she have a soul? What place did she have in the world? Was she alive? Was she undead? And that proved quite interesting in play. Largely proceeding out of a totally off the wall, on the fly life effect from a high level verbena. The last one was in the same mage game, and this was an NPC, an acolyte, who became to realize that that there were mages and what have you, and the characters liked her so much they wanted her to awaken, and they kept coming up with a variety of methods to force this poor character's avatar to awaken, this poor NPC's avatar to awaken, and as a consequence, of course, she was driven completely mad by this, and in the end, her avatar started to awaken, but her mind couldn't accept it. So the avatar would started to project out of her body and manifest itself in dreams and as a strange supernatural phenomena. And she was convinced that she was possessed, or that she was being haunted, or what have you. But in fact, it was her own spirit that was, trying to get out of her body, because she wouldn't awaken. So it was trying to find some way to awaken. And in the end, it killed her, the experience. So that takes us back to the concept of how an acolyte can provide a rather, uncompromising mirror to the mage, going, look what you've done to this poor woman, you horrible, horrible person. So yeah, those would be the retainers and ghouls incidents from my own games that I think stand out the most for me. What about you, Mike? Have you had much experience with these guys in games?
No. It's actually pretty interesting, because I picked up Ghouls as the first source book I ever read, and the entire point of the book, I think, is to bring ghouls to the forefront instead of having them be in the background, but never really came up. They're mostly just henchmen on the sidelines.
Right.
I'm trying to think of a few more examples of where I've seen ghouls used well, or retainers used well, and sometimes where it's got a little bit out of hand. A particular time was in a Vampire the Dark Ages game where a friend's character, so I was playing a Malkavian who was quite insane in French, but his character was one of these Norse gangrel, who obviously had a ghouled wolf. And it became a running joke that whenever the player wanted to talk to his ghoul, it was like, why is this wolf always seeming to be so wise? It was like, yes, master, I shall go hunt them for you. It's like, no, this is a wolf. Stop. I must stop talking like he's from Narnia. It got a little too extreme that this wolf was actually better at doing things than the player's own character.
Excellent. Very cool.
And then I think other things I've noted, Changeling the Lost is kind of interesting because, of course, your way of introducing someone into their world is through the pledge of one of the pledges, so they're kind of touched by the weird and glamour. And it was a character's priest. So his character was a doctor. Who was from, I think, the 60s or so, and it's set in Venice, so there's the view of, well, your character would more than likely be Catholic, and the reason for bringing this priest into his world was to reconcile what the Fae were with his Catholic upbringing. Was he cursed in some way? Were the Fae demons? And the priest was to help work through his own psychological trauma. And that's been quite a good way of making use of retainers, and again, using retainers to act as a mirror to the characters themselves.
Yeah, that does seem to be a recurring theme, huh?
Otherwise, I think that's about it, really, with my own use of retainers. They're definitely a bad thing to forget about in a game. It should never be just another gun to point at someone. It can be offer lots of different role-playing potential.
Yeah, we had a retainer once, made us familiar, who was a 3 million year old, slightly awakened monkey called Gilbert, and he could use guns, but again, that's probably best left for another day.
All right, cool. Mark, I think we're just about done. Take us out of here.
I think so. Okay, well, so for the Darkling episode number 17, our 20-minute sister show, I think we've gone deep into the world of ghouls and retainers. So I want to say a big thanks again to the Marquis Von Vimanys to getting us started on this with his excellent submission, which he sent in to the email address. And for those of you who want to do the same or send us your praises, your curses, your suggestions, or your salutations, that's darkerdaysradio@gmail.com. Well, of course, we are modern and up to date, so we're not just limiting ourselves to email. You can join us on Facebook, again, Darker Days Radio, and as yesterday, you can follow us on Twitter, which is, surprise, surprise, Darker Days Radio. So keep up with all the latest news there. Now, we'll be returning to, could be one of any topics in the next full Darker Days show. We have a host of stuff to choose from, including an interview with the host of World of Darkness News. We have some new World of Darkness rapid fires to throw your way. And we're trying to sort something out regarding a certain anniversary product, which has been doing the rounds recently on the internet. No prizes for guessing what that would be.
What the vampire, was it? Make your own adventure. What was that book they brought out? There was only a few scanned-in pages. I haven't looked at it myself yet, but I think it should be.
I got killed by El Diablo Verde. That just sucked. That did.
I found out that there's a way to. You can't win, but you can stave off the inevitable by doing an endless loop and just going back and forth. So El Diablo won't kill you, and the Sabbat won't turn you into a chair.
Right, I'm gonna go and find that out now.
It's like if you play as a true Brujar, then, is it? You just keep going around in an endless loop.
All right, we're done. Have a good night, folks.
Bye, guys.